and welcome to the Deconstructed Interview panel. Before we get started, if you have any questions during this discussion, please feel free to utilize the Q&A button that should be located at the bottom of your Zoom bar. Our goal in this session is to really think about the interview, a key tactical component in the career. And our hope is that we'll be able to, deconstruct and to think about the components of it. What's it like being an interviewee versus the interviewer, and hopefully give you some insights so that you will feel more confident and able to succeed when you have an interview. To get rolling, we have an initial poll that will help us to see who's on our audience today. Please bring up poll number 1. And as we're getting ready on closing that poll, are we able to see the results? So it looks like on our panel today, we have a pretty diverse group from sophomores, juniors, and seniors with a slight edge to seniors. In terms of our majors are also quite a blend, with a mix from those in the healthcare medicine field to technology, both at 20%, some that are interested in academia and consulting, each at 10%, and an even larger group who are in the either undecided or other. So this is, I think, will be great as we dig in, because we have a diverse group of panelists from different industries and different backgrounds. So with that, let's go around and have introductions. If each member of the panel would please list their name, company and role, their connection to Penn, of course, and also maybe add in their favorite place on campus. With that, pass to you, Angie.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Angie Lowe. I'm currently a senior university recruiter at Uber's Advanced Technologies Group, which is our self-driving group. I'm a 2011 bio major. So obviously, your major does not dictate what you end up doing. My favorite place on campus is not necessarily this background, which is the bio pond, but I thought it was a nice throwback to my days heading over to lecture. I would say my favorite place on campus is probably that green space in front of the high rises. It was like a fun place to hang out and meet people outside. But looking forward to meeting everyone today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Khalilah?
Hi, I guess it's good afternoon, maybe good morning for some. My name is Khalilah Lawson, class of 2000, a great year for that's 20 years ago, my goodness. My major was sociology, and interestingly enough, though I didn't go to academia, I do feel like some of the research that I learned, the way to do research that I learned at Penn has helped me in my career. So I'm currently the director of executive search for Comcast, specifically for core functions, HR, finance, communications, and government affairs. One of my favorite parts of Penn would be Houston Hall. Spent a lot of time there, whether that be partying and or studying, because there's always this great cove to spend time in. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. And Jamie?
Hi, thanks again for having me today. My name is Jamie Zinn. I also graduated from Penn in 2000, so definitely a great year. I was a psychology major. And I spent a number of years working in executive search as well as campus recruiting. And I'm now an executive director of human resources at Morgan Stanley as part of the wealth management division. So I have recruiting as part of my responsibilities. In terms of my favorite places at Penn, I have to say probably spent a lot of time at Smokes. And when I go back to Philly, I love to go to Scoop DeVille to get ice cream, which I know is off campus, but it's one of my favorites.
That's great, thank you. And I'm John Adractas. I'll be moderating today. I was a Penn undergraduate, class of 1998. So just a few years prior, I studied mathematics and philosophy. I think my parents cried slightly when they first heard of my majors and thought, what would that translate into? And I have to say, the ways in which I have used them have just proven over and over again to be so versatile. One of those where you have to kind of close your eyes and follow your heart, and I did. Super pleased. I am the CEO founder of Encircle Labs. We are trying to build trust into home construction and are a fintech currently in stealth mode. And for me, my favorite place on campus is not so much a place, but kind of this locust walk. For me, I think just the feel that I get when I was a student and or an alumni coming back, there was always something magical about walking down Locust Walk. And I still love it to this day. So with that, let's jump right in. And as a starting point, let's really kind of think about the structure of an interview itself, right? What are the key components? Let's think about before, during, and after an interview. So with that, who would like to kick off? And perhaps let's just focus on before right now. What does one do as you're thinking about you have an interview? How do you get prepared?
I'd be happy to start, John.
Excellent, thank you.
So I think preparing for your interview is really important. And as you're going through your interview process, I'm sure you're also busy and it may feel like you can just wing it, but really important to take the time to prepare. I would say one of the most important things is doing your research on the company, on the job that you're interviewing for. I know for Morgan Stanley, actually our website has a section that's dedicated specifically to campus interviewing and to helping you prepare for your interview and understanding the firm and company jargon. So whatever company you're interviewing with or organization, spend the time looking at their website and network. If you know that you're interested in a specific company, make sure you're taking the time between now and whenever your interviews come up to attend all the various networking or just educational events that organization might have on campus. And so to just help you be even better prepared for your interview. The one other thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues, is make sure that you spend the time preparing for what you're going to say during your interview and thinking about how you're going to sell yourself. So I'm sure my colleagues have similar things to say, so I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks,
Angie?
Jamie. Yeah, I can jump off of that. So I was also a career counselor at UC Berkeley. So putting on my career counselor hat, I definitely agree with Jamie in terms of preparing some of those talking points or stories. So think about, what are past experiences, what are projects that you've worked on that you would like to share. And the STAR method is kind of a nice way to do it: situation, task, action, result. There's a lot of different ones. I've heard CHI, challenge, hurdle, action, I think implementation or something. But really understand some of your past experiences, how they might apply to a lot of different behavioral questions, or even how they might apply to technical questions too, in terms of working with a challenging colleague, overcoming an obstacle. Think of those, preparation points as really key, and you can apply it to, not just one company's interview, but a lot of different, so that you're really strategizing what you're preparing, understanding that your time is limited as a student.
Thank you, Angie. Khalilah, do you see it the same way? Other thoughts?
Yes, right. So my colleagues, Angie and Jamie, really hit it on the head. I would definitely say all of that. And one of the things that I've noticed when it comes to preparing for the interview, not only is it just, looking at the company, but it's also what is the company doing in the community. There's so much around community impact, and then being able to understand not only what they're doing currently, but what their plans are. Another quick tip before you walk into your interview is to Google or whatever search engine you choose, the company, to see what is top of mind. So maybe they had a really great product that launched the day before, or maybe it launched that morning. And so you'll have credibility when you walk right into that interview saying, oh, I see that this happened. Second is really understanding what the position description says and how you meet those must-haves. So go through the 5 or 6 that they have, try to align. And if you don't, that's okay. You talk about it. And you really just create your story. So I do agree with my 2 colleagues on the preparation part is key, but then also being as authentic as you can.
This careful balance of when prepared, you don't want to walk in and suddenly be so rigid as that you're reading your script and ready to go, because as we'll get into in a minute, that you won't be able to control what happens in the room, and that's probably not what you want to present as you arrive, but yet how do you feel prepared? I particularly like the point about being conscious of news and things that may have changed recently, whether a company had new fundraising, customer announcements, product announcements, challenges. And I'll add to that as well, you can often learn a lot about who's interviewing. This is also a time where you may very well be able to see that person's blog posts, perhaps they've presented or spoken before, and in some ways you can understand a bit about the people who you'll be meeting. So with that, let's flip it now to think about during. So you've done your preparation. We've assumed you've put those efforts in, and now it's the actual day of the interview. What are the things that kind of come to mind as the most important things to be thinking about as you're going to your interview? Who would like to kick us off?
I can kick off.
Happy to.
Oh, go ahead, Khalilah.
Go, Angie. Go, Angie. I'll go behind you. Go.
Okay, sounds good. I think the first thing to remember is your interview is not some sort of exam or test. There is a human on the other side. There are multiple humans on the other side of the interview, and they really want you to succeed. You know, no one wants a bad interview for both the interviewer and the interviewee. So, you know, take some of those hints or take some of those follow-up questions. And, you know, I think like if your interview is not going well, you can recover from it. It's not that the first impression is made in 10 seconds and then the next 30 minutes don't count for anything. You know, we all want you to succeed in your interviews. That's why we scheduled the interviews in the first place. It's a valuable use of the team's time for, you know, them to be taking time out of their workday to be interviewing you. So they want to maximize it as much as you do as a student. So there's definitely a two-way street there in terms of, you know, us both channels wanting you to succeed. And I think the other thing is also don't take anything personally during an interview, unless it's something very egregious, which, you know, is a different discussion. You know, they're really just trying to get at, you know, why are you a great fit for this role? Tell me more about you. I want to learn more. And so I think at the end of the day, you just have to remember that there is a human on the other side of things. And we do want you to succeed in an interview. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget when you're kind of stuck in like exam season and interviewing at the same time.
That, as Angie has sort of set the stage, talking about in particular that human being behind, I find in my head, I'm even just picturing at times whether that person also may have certain questions they need to get through that in fact might be an agenda, but it's not even kind of the way they might be kind of if you stepped out of the interview context. So all of that notion that you as the interviewer, you have an agenda and they also have this agenda. And how does that play out in the course of a conversation? With that, Khalilah, you were...
Thank you, John. I completely agree. You know, I love, Angie, what you were talking about in terms of, you know, you can recover. So much, you know, there's so much pressure to get it done. But again, they're human and many of them might not be interviewing often as well. So it's just an opportunity to relax and just to, you know, show how you might contribute to the organization versus just the fit. Because I think if we get caught on the fit, we kind of just stumble a little bit. In the interview process, I like to bring not your whole self. So there's a whole controversy about that, but it's the opportunity to bring and tell your story. Tell your story of why you're there, what's interesting to you. And then my last thing would be ask the question, what haven't I asked you? It's just a really great way for individuals to be more relaxed, especially when you are being interviewed by a panel. because it could probably answer a couple of questions that you might not have thought of. So that's one of the things that I found really helpful. And surprisingly, a lot of dialogue comes from that. You're starting to do a strategy. So I thought that was something that I've utilized often. It's been helpful.
Khalilah, you started to touch upon, we've now also spoken about being authentic,
Yeah.
but you've established that there's also boundaries to that.
Absolutely.
As you say that, is there a way to kind of help people gauge what's the difference between authentic and a boundary that you might have in mind?
Yeah. So you know, as I guess I talked about in terms of bringing your full self, I don't actually think anyone can bring their full self personally to an interview or to the position. Of course, you want to keep a little bit to yourself, but you can have authenticity around what you've been able to do, what you are passionate about, where your comfort level is, not only how you lead, but how you like to be led, and then what you require in terms of affirmation. Those are the things that I think would be critical for bringing your, if you would, authentic self. I like to say you're bringing as much authenticity as possible, and you do your very best. So that's the way I view authenticity.
That's great. Jamie, what does it feel like, I mean, being in New York from a different perspective? Is there a boundary of authenticism versus kind of what's out of bounds and that? Do you see it differently?
No, I agree with Khalilah. And I think I would say, you know, most companies, interviewers are human. We want to get to know the people who we're going to be working with potentially. So we want to get to know you. We don't need to know what you did last night. We don't need to know, you know, how messy your apartment is, or how late you stayed up studying, or any of those things. So I think, yes, be authentic, but bring the self that you want to present at work. And I know we'll talk about this later, but you have to be mindful of the company culture. And if you're interviewing with a company where people are more likely to be wearing suits, don't wear your gym t-shirt and show them how great you are at working out. That's the balance I would bring. I have a couple things to add in terms of just during the interview. I think in terms of answering questions, it's very easy in an interview to kind of get lost and answer something that the interviewer didn't ask. So pay attention to the questions and make sure you stick to that, what they're looking for. And remember that you're not just what you've done in your last internship. Everyone has done things either in classes or in extracurriculars, and you bring leadership and other experience with you from those other extracurricular other activities in your life, even if it's babysitting and taking on responsibility in that way. So think about all of that as you're answering questions. The other thing I would say before you wrap up an interview is make sure you're asking questions. I know we'll talk about that probably more later, but make sure that you have come into the interview with a list of questions about, here's what I saw in the news today, or here's what I saw on your website, or I'd like to understand more about your culture or what this job is. I would not leave the interview without asking some questions of the interviewer.
Hey, John, can I just add one more really quick, one quick thing? And it just really just dovetails to what Jamie was speaking of, just preparing and not only answering the question, but then also preparing why you are interested in that specific company. There is nothing worse than not talking about why you are interested in that company and that role. So you need to nail that and understand why.
Well, I think as we start to highlight it, if there's one thing in your preparation, it would be fair to, if we all see who agrees with, you can expect to hear why us in terms of a company. And we see the nodding. I'm completely with you. And also that classic question of, do you have any questions for us? Like, you can expect to get these two answers. So you either spend time thinking about them and preparing, or you will be doing it kind of on the fly, real time in the interview. Is there a parallel? One thinks of test taking and test strategies, and sometimes you're thinking about what are they trying to get at by asking this kind of question. Do you think there's a parallel from the interview perspective when they're asking a question? Is it really about your last internship, or is there a broader kind of deeper meaning underneath of it? And how relevant do you think of that for the interviewee to consider?
So I can take that. I think that particularly when you're in school and you're going for an interview for your first job or your internship, the interviewer wants to just get to know you. We know that you probably have never been an investment banker before or a technologist. You haven't done that. But what the interviewer is trying to find out is, tell me why you're interested in this job and what you've done that is, or learned about, that is relevant and makes you excited about it and makes you a good candidate. So you can think about all the things you've done in your background or learned about or read about that make you excited for that job. And I think those are, don't be worried that you don't have an answer. You can bring all of those to your response.
May I add, you were talking about, test taking. And the way I think of it when interviewers are going deeper into questions is basically they're trying to figure out how you think. How do you get to the answer? It might not be, and I love that, Jamie, you're not, an investment banker walking in the door, but it could be a matter of, so how do you think to potentially become an investment banker? And how do you use research to allow you to get there? What's been your thought process? What's been your journey? How do you think? I think will be critical. And those are some of the things I think behaviorally, and I know we're going to talk about this later, for behavioral interviewing.
I'll just add on the flip side of that, I recruit for a lot of software engineering roles, and there is an expectation of understanding technical skills. You are a student, so there's a different expectation than there would be for someone who's already in a full-time role. But there is kind of a bar that has to be kind of passed for some of those technical roles. So especially if you're looking at internships or full-time roles that require some degree of technical skills, you do need to think about, do I understand not only how I do something, but why I do something? Can I illustrate that in an interview, whether it's live coding during a software engineering interview, or even like doing some math in, an investment banking interview? Like, you do have to understand what the role is entailing, because that's what some of those questions are going to get at, especially on the technical side of things.
Angie, it reminds me of when people say, show your work. Remember?
Oh.
Back to basics.
Indeed. And I would certainly just add to that. I mean, personally, as an interviewer, I often ask questions that I think are unexpected by many candidates. So you can tell that they're ready to tell you about all these details on their resume. And I actually have a habit of interviewing people without having looked at a resume. And it's somewhat intentional because I'm really interested in the person, and also has to do with kind of what I'm trying to achieve when I'm interviewing. And I'm often asking why questions. And I'll many times just start with, I will know that they went to school or not, so we're careful in terms of that question, but to ask, so what did you study and why did you study that? And I think people sometimes are sort of surprised, right? What point in your life did you decide that this is what you wanted to pursue? And you could have been an astronaut, you could have been a firefighter, whatever variation on a theme. And it is interesting to just see how when people really open up, I'm accomplishing the goal that I have in my mind, which is I really want to understand the person in front of me that I have, 30 minutes with, 45 minutes. And then instead of often asking what they did at the job, I'm asking why they chose that job and why did they choose to then move on? And what was the calculus in their head as they were thinking about that? Because that particularly helps me to understand, how reflective they were, how were they thinking about their personal goals? And then that next question of also, well, what do you want next? And many times saying, let's assume that the company that you're interviewing at didn't exist. What would you be considering and why? And it's amazing how these simple why questions, I often find you can get a really authentic person that comes through, or sometimes you get a person where it feels pretty limited, like it was just set up for this perfect one setup. And that's a glaring difference at times. So with that, we've really dove in here on the during. So when the interviews finish, is that it? Is there something that comes after that one should be thinking about? What's the post-interview thought process. Anyone like to jump in?
I'll go. This is probably one of my favorite parts of the interview because you can leave, I would say you could leave your impression on an individual afterwards. So probably at the end of the interview, asking for that person's email address could be helpful, just so you don't have to go scurrying and looking for it later. And then it's okay to then send a LinkedIn invitation after that. I would also say a handwritten note goes a long way. Jamie, myself, and Angie, and John were talking about handwritten notes. As much as it might be antiquated, it still feels special. And you want individuals who are interviewing you to feel special. And the follow-up should be quick and deliberate. Do not do a huge 2-page thank you letter. I mean, maybe my team would agree, but it's just not, people won't read that much, just like when it comes to like longer cover letters. So I would say definitely do that, and do not use a read receipt email ever.
Okay, so a clear perspective on things to certainly be thinking about after, and perhaps some boundaries around that. Jamie or Angie, would you like to? Do you see it the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with everything Khalilah said, and I wouldn't wait too long. I think if you wait 2 or 3 or 4 days and then you're still considering sending an email, just forget it at that point, because then you've moved on. I'll just throw in a don't. Don't badger your interviewers for an update. I have had, in my experience, candidates who followed up with an email, just checking in, then a phone call, then another phone call. Recruiters, hiring managers want to get back to you as soon as they have an answer, but be thoughtful about your follow-up.
And Angie, from your side, is
Yeah.
it general the same? Some different intricacies?
I'll be the contrarian here. I think for tech or for like software engineering or hardware engineering, I don't necessarily think a thank you note is required, whereas I think in a lot of other industries, it is definitely a best practice. But it can also go a long way to, help you stand out. So if you are able to like write a quick email, maybe like the day after, just to thank, the interviewer for their time, thank the recruiter for their time, it does go a long way. But I would say that is not the norm as it is in other industries. But to go off of Jamie's point, I definitely agree. Please do not badger your recruiters or your hiring managers. We are trying to get to you as soon as possible. So I think a good kind of timeline is follow up maybe after 2 weeks if you hadn't heard anything, just for maybe like an update. The other thing, as you're actively recruiting and interviewing at other companies, it is really helpful on the recruiting side if you update us with your deadlines as well. So if you have another offer, please tell us. Tell everybody else you're interviewing with, so that sometimes timelines can be negotiated and we can try to move quickly to accommodate your timeline. So I think it's definitely like open communication when it comes to timelines, but understand there's a human at the end of it, and sometimes like we don't have an update the next day, and like that's kind of normal. So wait an appropriate amount of time, 2 weeks, and then I think that's definitely fine to follow up and just ask for an update on the timeline.
Thank you, Angie. I think really starting to see also that while there are many core aspects that are the same, really just as the being interviewed in general, but there are also differences, right, that come out depending on the industry. I'm reminded to an earlier time in my career where going to Google now some 14 years ago, there was a rather infamous recruiting process that in some cases took months. And it used to drive candidates crazy. It was one of the biggest pain points that many people would describe was, why did it take a 3 months interview process that would often involve being asked to come back 2 times, even 3 times, and just a lengthy process. But that was the norm at that time, right, for that particular company. And this can vary dramatically. And I think we see some of the differences in what that process is. And I'm always reminded also, I think whether urban legend or not, there was that one candidate who supposedly once sent a fish tank with a shark to the recruiter and said that, like that shark, I am a shark. And it was meant to sort of play out well. It didn't. He didn't get the job. Was probably a very costly way to lose actually the opportunity he was considering at the time. So there are all ranges of ways to think about that prep and how you handle. So with that, let's take a step back for a moment, and we have a second poll. And this will really help us to understand not just from what you've been studying, but what you're thinking about as you go toward next. So please, if we could bring up our second poll. And here, this is really to help us understand what are the industries, the verticals that you may be thinking about, as well as within a given company. And the second question, what are the roles that are perhaps something you're exploring, or perhaps have an even more clear view that that's where you know you want to head toward. And when you're filling out, you may have to scroll down. And we'll just give that a little bit longer. Great. If we can we see the poll results? And in the meantime, there was a question that came in as far as the handwritten note. And I think we addressed that, but just making sure that we adequately covered that.
So when I mentioned the handwritten note earlier, it was actually a written note on a note card that you have, that you put a stamp on, that you put in the mail. It makes individuals feel so special because generally speaking, we don't get email. I mean, we don't get mail. We get a lot of email. We get a lot of, digital connections, but there's something, I know it's COVID times, but there's something, different when you actually receive something in the mail. So you could send it to wherever you went, make sure you write the address down and the zip code, and then you send it off. It's just a really, just a lovely opportunity. Just like Jamie said, do it the next day or even do it that day. So they would receive it pretty quickly.
I agree. It feels like the lost art. Most of us are not sending anything handwritten to anyone, but just to open up, a simple professional thank you note, not something overly flowery, but something that shows that you as a candidate took the time to write 2 or 3 sentences. Makes a big difference.
I'll just say on the flip side of that, I would not know what address to share with you. We're often like moving between buildings. I personally would not know what to do with a handwritten note. So I think you really have to understand the industry, understand the company culture, and if that is appropriate for the type of role.
Great. So if we could bring up the results of the poll now, it can help us to see who is interested about what areas. Okay, so in terms of industries, just taking a look here, we have 2 that notably stand out. Government and public services is about 1/3, healthcare at 20%, and finance and entrepreneurship each at around 15%. So this gives a good sense of just the diversity of interests that are on the session today. In terms of the functions within, the largest stands out as not sure, which is not surprising at all. And as we sort of look to see where there's greater certainty, you have basically accounting and finance is one area that 20% stands out, and other. So it just goes to show in terms of what we listed here didn't cover, and I think that's great. But there's a mix of between the marketing side, international, legal, and really a large chunk of people that this will be an exploration. So with that, in order to kind of dive in, and particularly as we're thinking about exploring, we started to talk about an interview and its components in terms of before, during, and after, and some of the differences started coming out, right, in terms of, for one side of the US versus another, from the tech to the financial services. So let's push on that a bit further in terms of by industry, company, and culture. In your experiences, how much does that really matter? And I'm going to bring that to you, Angie. But Do you think this is a big difference?
Thanks, John. I would say yes, as I'm sure you've kind of already understood from some of my responses. Tech is a little bit more casual. So, you can show up to your interview in jeans, maybe also a blazer, and be okay. Whereas that would be like definitely a no-go in other industries. So I think it's helpful to take cues from, ask around, see who else has kind of interviewed in those types of, industries. Look at company websites. That's actually usually a good kind of marker of, what is our company culture like? What are people wearing? What are people talking about? There's lots of videos now on websites or like during campus recruiting. Companies will share, videos or virtual events or whatnot. I think even if you don't have the time to attend all of them, kind of pick and choose a few, just so that you can explore your options in terms of what are the industries out there, and understand, as an extension of that, what might the interview day look like. It could be, a full-on day-long kind of extravaganza. I think at Uber, we call them super days, where there's a ton of people interviewing for, similar roles on the same day. Or it could be, less kind of day-long formal and more like maybe a half day of interviewing for a full-time role. For internships, they do tend to be a lot shorter. So you really just have to understand like what is the industry, do your research in terms of like what else is out there, of what you can expect from different industries, and that'll help you prepare, by industry and understand what some of the norms are.
So with that, building on that, Khalilah, how does it differ depending on the role that you're pursuing, right? So even within a company, are there differences there, and perhaps even down to the level of the person interviewing you?
So it's interesting because when it comes to role and function, it is specific to the industry. So if you're walking into a financial services organization focused on an accountant one position, versus if you're coming to an organization like Comcast, where we have it's a full gamut, technology and those core functions, you need to be prepared to say not only why you're interested in specifically in that role, but then also functionally speaking, how would you, transition into something like that? So if you take a vertical like HR cuts across all of our industries. And so at Angie's organization, it might be a little bit different at my organization and then Jamie's. And when you think about it, horizontally from the industries, you just need to, prepare yourself on the social norms of that specific organization, that specific industry, coupled with the function. So I think it's bifurcated, John, but then it's a blend of it to make sure that you're speaking to both function / role and industry.
So what about as we think about then, these are obviously key dimensions, and I think Angie touched a bit upon this in terms of the interview type, where if this is part of open versus say campus or other variations, how is that different? And Jamie, I don't know if you want to take that one.
So I think it's important to understand when you're interviewing whether the role that you're interviewing for is part of a training program or sort of a large hiring effort where you're going to be one of 10, 20, 50 people coming into a similar kind of role out of school. Or if you're a senior and you're looking for something that's maybe a little bit more specific, or you're later in the year, and this is not a bad thing, but you might be applying for a job that's open now or that's open in June, and it's what we'll call a lateral hire. So neither one is better or worse than the other. But when you're interviewing for, what we'll say a program, there is usually a large campus recruiting effort that's focused on hiring those 50 people to do that similar kind of role. And so you have teams that have been practicing and prepping for what kind of interview they're gonna have and the questions that they're gonna ask. And there's probably a panel of maybe some recent alumni and some more experienced managers. And I would expect a little more structure around that kind of interview, and also probably more information available on the company's website. if you're interviewing for, the one HR role at this small company, or the one marketing role, or if it's a big company, you might not have as much information readily available about that kind of role. You might have to do a little more individual research, and the interviewer or interviewers are less structured. So you may get some people who are fantastic, well-prepared interviewers. You may get some people who are not really super experienced hiring managers, and they may not know all the right questions to ask. So when you have that kind of interview, I would say just be prepared, even more in terms of why you want that role and how you can help lead the interviewer to understand your skill set, your interests, and ask more questions about the role if it's, you don't find pages and pages of information available on the company's website.
Thank you, Jamie. I think you particularly touched on something we haven't spoken as much about, which is the person who's interviewing you does a lot of preparation in advance. And I think as you were describing, where as teams, they're thinking about how are they going to approach the interview? How are they going to accomplish the screening that they're hoping for? And I think that really just raised the question of, as you're coming into one of these programs and there may be multiple interviews, would you suggest that interviews are typically all independent events versus collaboration that's occurring behind the scenes? And when you kind of think about that, does that change the way that we approach an interview if one interview is connected to the next interview in terms of information passed versus where they may feel more independent?
So I think even though the structure might be different, you should expect that everyone you met with throughout the process, whether it's on one day or 10 days, is going to regroup. They're going to talk about the candidates they met. They're going to talk about strengths and development areas and who stood out. So I think either way, you need to prepare and know that they're talking to each other. So if you're inconsistent in your answers, they're going to say, well, Jamie told me she was interested in finance, but she told me she liked technology. So make sure that you are ready to be consistent in your thought process.
Another thing, Jamie, is to, if you feel like you bumbled a question in the previous interview, you could potentially bring it up in your current interview. And if there's something that you really wanted to have said in the previous interview, you can do it. You can absolutely build it up and include that in the current interview. So I love that. It's absolutely true. We call it debrief conversations for each candidate. And yes, we are talking collectively. And sometimes we have specific questions that each of us are asking to get different answers. So just be mindful of that for the consistency that Jamie talked about.
So it sounds like in particular there, Khalilah, you're alluding that at times each of the interviewers may in fact have a slightly different agenda, trying to piece together the more complete picture of you, the candidate, which is, again, I think speaks to as you're in the interview, being able to not just, of course, be your authentic self, but as we talked about those questions and kind of understanding what they're trying to accomplish. One person might be helping push in this area versus another. And that this is part of, if you think of it as you're being interviewed kind of across people, and it's not really just a single interview. We've sort of turned the interview now into the interaction, right? The interaction with different people who will be asking you questions and getting to know you.
John, I'd just like to add, for the sophomores and juniors out there who are, looking for internships, this may be less the case. Our internship interviews tend to be shorter. It might just be up to maybe one hiring manager or a small sub team, maybe a couple of the people that you interviewed with, to make a final decision about extending an offer for an internship. Whereas, a full-time role is a much bigger commitment from the company. So that will differ in terms of like who debriefs, who's going to be talking to whom, throughout your interview and decision process.
So I think we've now had a good chance to set up the components, to think about things that are different and or the same across interviews. So let's sort of turn now to a bit of more of a rapid round where we a series of questions we had from our side. And this is just a reminder again to those that are listening in. If you have questions, please add them and we will try our best to incorporate them. So first off, I think we've said many things today in terms of cover letters and thank you notes and kind of LinkedIn. Maybe just get down to something as simple as even just the background in your video. Is if you are in kind of COVID times and you're on a you're on a Zoom, does it matter what's behind you? Thoughts?
Yes, it matters completely. Whether, no one wants to see something messy, it's a distraction. That's all it is. So blur your screen. Try not to have a lot of, and I know this is rapid, John, but try not to have a lot of background noise in your conversation. I mean, this is your opportunity moment to shine, and you do not want any distractions. I would start there. And I know my colleagues are going to talk about it a little bit more too, but no, it absolutely matters completely.
Anyone see it differently? Same page?
I definitely think it matters, but if your interview's on Zoom, you can use the virtual background like I'm using it right now, cover up your messy room. But yes, like your environment matters. You want to make sure that you're well heard too.
Great.
Agree. And just think about that. I think it goes back to what we were saying before in terms of being authentic, but not, being aware of who you're talking to and what you want to present. Hide your messy laundry. If you have posters that an interviewer might think are somewhat inappropriate or something, hide those. A nice background is great. Be aware of, you don't want something too flashy. Just be aware of what the background is.
So we go from the background to what you wear. Now, we just touched briefly in terms of that there are kind of company things to think about, but are there just general rules of thumb of maybe of boundaries that one should think about in terms of addressing? And someone had a particularly funny story early on about perhaps something not to do.
I can share that funny story. I'll say for dress code, regardless of what industry, dress for your best day on the job. Understanding what that job is and what industry that's in. I think in tech, it can be very casual. Candidates show up to interviews in their t-shirts and that's accepted. But sometimes it can be too casual. We did have a recent event where a student showed up to a virtual event at the beach and was not wearing a shirt. That's definitely pushing the envelope too far. So, I think, again, understand your industry. Dress code will differ.
And I will say I'm somewhat laughing because maybe it's my East Coast being raised, but having lived on the West Coast, when I was still in that transition, getting to New York out of my system, I probably dressed more formally than most did at Google. And I had a moment where a product manager who had been there for two plus years looked at me and was like, "Man, you are giving us a bad reputation." And I looked at him and I thought, "What?" And there were people coming in for interview. And from his perspective, the fact that I was wearing a button-down shirt and jeans was actually like out of character. And the person who said this to me at the time literally had shorts on, his bare legs. He had a pair of flip-flops on and a t-shirt. And we definitely looked different, but it was just one of where I thought, oh, wow, he's thinking of it as I'm actually giving a bad impression. And in my mind, I was thinking, dude, I don't need to see your those legs. Please hide those. So it was just a very different set of culture. And then, of course, you continue to adapt. But yet, I put on a jacket today, but I happen to have jeans below, which has become much more common as that's formal if you're on the West Coast. With that, favorite question? Favorite question you've heard in an interview? Oh, Jamie?
I probably stand out as the New Yorker in financial services wearing a blazer. So, definitely be aware of the industry.
Perfect. So with that, I think our time has actually been flying past us. So as we get into conclusion here, I hope that everyone has enjoyed our session. There is now a final session, how to leverage the Penn network, which I really hope that you will have an opportunity to join. And certainly I've always felt a beneficiary of the Penn network as well as our great panelists today. And I want to thank Angie, Khalilah, Jamie. Thank you for joining me in today's session. Penn Network has always played a crucial role in certainly my own career growth. And I hope that as you remain in the room, you will just be simply directed to that session so you don't have to go anywhere. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, team.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good luck.